Welcome, everyone, to the Harriman Institute at Columbia University's discussion about Kate Ferguson's book, Architectures of Violence, The Command Structures of Modern Mass Atrocities, featuring our discussant, Tanya Domi. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College, and it's my great honor to moderate today's event at the Harriman Institute, which is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. The Harriman Institute's mission is to serve the community at Columbia University and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events to bring together extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. The Institute is committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy, and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. Today's event is being recorded, and we encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now, to kick things off, please join me in welcoming Kate Ferguson, an internationally recognized foreign policy expert and strategist specializing in mass atrocity prevention, human rights, and divided communities. Kate's book, Architectures of Violence, The Command Structures of Modern Mass Atrocities, explores the case of the former Yugoslavia, exposing the relationships between paramilitaries, state commands, local communities, and organized crime present in modern mass atrocities from Rwanda and Darfur to Syria and Myanmar. Her inquiry into these overlooked dynamics of mass violence unveils the substantial loopholes in current atrocity prevention architecture. In 2014, Kate co-founded Protection Approaches, a UK-based human rights NGO that exists to transform how identity-based violence is understood and prevented. At PA, she is co-executive director and heads up research and policy. She is chair of policy at the European Center for the Responsibility to Protect, where she works with the executive team to bridge the academic and policy worlds. And just this month, she was announced as a specialist advisor to the UK's Parliamentary International Development Committee for the duration of the current inquiry, promoting dialogue and preventing atrocities, the UK government approach. Kate has published widely on subjects relating to mass atrocities and identity-based violence, particularly the recent history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and has presented her research and policy work around the world. Kate, the floor is yours.
Gosh, thank you so much for such a generous and warm introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here, and it feels a real treat to be with all of you today. I recognise some names in the attendees, so hello to those, but also hi to those I don't yet know. I don't want to say very much to kick us off, because I'm sure we'll have more fun debating and talking. But I suppose whenever I get the chance to talk about this book, it always makes me think about where it came from. And I think really it came from a couple of places, but that's kind of crystallized maybe in a conversation I had, I think it was back maybe in 2009, with a former senior front bench Conservative member of Parliament who had been instrumental in the Britain's Bosnia policy in the early 90s. And I was interviewing him for some research about UK's Bosnia policy. And he said a couple of things that really, to me, are illustrative of what bad policy in the face of mass atrocity looks like. He said that the presence of paramilitaries and non-state armed actors, although he didn't call them that, inhibited more proactive and further engagement from Britain to help prevent those atrocities going on. He also said that the UK didn't know who was committing the violence in Bosnia in the 1990s. It was impossible to know who was doing what. Everyone committed atrocities. He said he wasn't quite sure if what had happened in Srebrenica in July 95 was a genocide. And he said, why would we do anything? It's not in the British interest. And that really kind of propelled, I suppose, what became my PhD study. And in tandem to that, what ended up being the decision to found Protection Approaches in the first place. Because it was this desire to really look at the validity of that argument that states like the United Kingdom made in the 90s and continue to make to this day, that not knowing who is committing what violence is somehow a legitimate explanation for poor policy, and that itself is the answer for non-action. And when I say action, I don't mean military necessarily. I mean the entire spectrum of engagement that can contribute to mitigating and preventing atrocities, and when necessary, protecting people from them occurring. So I really wanted to think about how valid that was as an argument. And I also wanted to look at where it came from. And, you know, on the one hand, we can say that maybe it is a cynical explanation used by states that do not want to take very complex foreign policy issues seriously. But on the other, and something that I really found in this research, was that it is a set of narratives that benefits the perpetrators. And so therefore the perpetrating structures are often very, very clever at driving those narratives themselves. We talk a lot now in a world that has become much more interconnected, much more online, much more communications based since 1991, 1992, about the power of disinformation and of fake news and of propaganda. And it might be my training as a historian, but that nefarious, malign presence has always been endemic and integral in the weapons and power of perpetrators and violators of human rights violations. And the closer our world becomes to one another, and the more that some kind of international legitimacy, whether for trade, whether for engagement in the multilateral system, whether for tourism, whether to keep the good opinion of your own populations, it becomes very important to propel those narratives. And so what so much of my work has looked at, both in the book, but also through my more practical work in the human rights activist space, is to sort of try and understand where contemporary identity-based violence, especially contemporary identity-based mass violence, including crimes against humanity and genocide, where they come from. And so what I do in this book is that I really sought to understand, map out, and then reconstruct what I call the architectures of violence that were present, particularly in Bosnia, but also in Croatia in the first half of the 1990s. And I used the materials and the extraordinary archives of the tribunals for former Yugoslavia. And while it would be a whole separate session to talk about the validity and positive and negative and varied contributions that tribunal has made towards justice, as a tool for historians and as a tool for prevention, those archives are extraordinary. They are online, they are translated into many different languages. And while, the search tools could be improved a little bit, you can have access to the biggest cache I've ever come across of evidence of where modern atrocities come from. So I am not a legal scholar, I am not a lawyer, I'm a historian and a practitioner. But what I was able to do was, using those vast materials, using the case notes, using the evidence that was used both on defense and prosecution, to piece together the structures that were state-led. And I looked not only from the Serbian and Bosnian Serb side, which many histories have chosen to, but also on the Croatian side, and also the Bosnian Muslim government, and looked at what were the political and formal military structures that existed. I then looked at that secondary level of the pseudo-state. We know that the war in Bosnia especially, but also the violence in Croatia, was characterized by the predominance of what those like Mary Calder considered to be new actors. I contest that. We've always had all sorts of people in the throes of war, but most especially we've had those actors when it has been about identity-based mass violence. And there is not a genocide in history, or if we want to not consider genocides before 1945 genocide, mass atrocity crimes or ethnic cleansing, that have not had the predominant presence of paramilitaries. And so I mapped out their connections, both through relationships, through money, through arms, through training, through geographies, and through presence in the field. I then came down to a third level, which was looking at the community violence that existed, or the violence that existed on a local level, and the extent to which that was driven by local bureaucracies, and so therefore still part of some kind of state structure. You can follow the evidence chain of instruction, or those where local actors genuinely chose to take up arms. Now, this narrative that is so prominent when violence appears to be driven by the interpretation of a perpetrator's conceptualization of their victim's identity, or the manipulation of that, it often leads in the international community or in the international press, particularly in the global north or the west, a sense that that violence is therefore communal, tribal. There's this language that somehow takes away the political and the rational from what are inherently political and rational crimes. And actually what I was able to map was, yes, there was of course some level of communal violence, in that it was communities participating. Sometimes there was a spontaneous taking up of arms. Certainly in Srebrenica, on the Bosnian Muslim side, it was a levée en masse to protect the local population. But it's really important to know the details of what we're talking about when we bring this language together. Does that levée en masse and that genuine spontaneity of taking up arms to protect a local population from direct, clear, coordinated assault make that act less legitimate? And I pose that as an open one to the room, because we don't yet have the infrastructure or understanding in state policy or within the United Nations or within the human rights sector to sufficiently answer that question. In understanding the relationship between that state-led construction of violence and the intentionality, particularly on the Serb and Bosnian Serb side, to conceal and devolve responsibility for the commission of crimes. So rather than, I mean, it can get complicated, but the hierarchical armed conflict, or the intentional removal and targeting of populations from areas, so the ethnic cleansing and the crimes against humanity and genocide that took place, you can see a relationship. And the state-led media and the narratives and the violence of hate speech and exclusion, the laws, the legislative changes that were being brought in, again, primarily I'm talking about on the Bosnian Serb and Serbian sides, can be seen to directly have the intended objective of producing what would then be interpreted both by the local population and the international community as spontaneous violence, which the state can then step back and say, well, this isn't us. This is something that we see time and time again in the instances of modern mass atrocity crimes. The final layer that I looked at was of the community or cultures of violence, the familial relationships. Who are the wives and girlfriends of these mostly male perpetrators that are operating within a very localized field of violence, who come home to their families, which is quite unusual in armed conflict. And again, it speaks to the dynamics of identity-based violence and the effectiveness of a devolved structure of division and violence, because in so creating these cultures of violence, you create divisions of ideology and of blood and of sacrifice that will take generations to recover from. And again, this is something that is not particular to the Western Balkans. It is something that you see throughout the history, modern, less modern, ancient, because it works. Running through those four categories, I suppose, of architectures was a theme of crime, organized crime, opportunism, because integral to the story of identity-based violence and atrocity in former Yugoslavia is, of course, the story of organized crime. However, it is not particular to that region. And I find it extraordinary that, 10 years or so now I've worked in the field of atrocity prevention, the disconnect between the approaches of combating serious and organized crime versus the approaches to atrocity prevention. And one of the things that I hope comes out of this book is that in that mapping, that network analysis, we see the crossover between many of those actors. And if we can understand that through seeing more holistically and in a much more evidence-based manner, the vastness of these architectures that support, initiate, facilitate, encourage, fund, instruct, commission mass atrocity crimes, what that gives us on the side of prevention and protection is extraordinary. It's a map of entry points. And so quite the opposite of thinking that when the warning signs of crimes against humanity or even genocide emerge, that it is therefore a morass. It is too complicated. We don't know who is committing the violence. We can't understand it. What is our responsibility? Quite the opposite. If we use this approach to understanding where these crimes come from, we have at our fingertips an enormously rich sort of map of entry points and levers for us to take advantage of. And so how I end the book, I suppose, in my attempt to be forward-looking and not to leave the lessons of Bosnia and Croatia in the 1990s as simply an appalling period of our collective history. Rather, it's how we can use those tools. And I end with a set of recommendations that moves beyond just the tools of that network analysis, but also a call to open up our current approaches to modern atrocity crimes that tend to still be too state-centric, not because states aren't overwhelmingly the central culpable perpetrating structure, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are the weak point. And so in understanding the many, many actors involved, both in resistance and in perpetration, it allows us to really challenge some of the approaches that so far have governed approaches to mass atrocity crimes, and I think limited them. So I will pause there. I look forward to going deeper and answering questions that people have. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. I was really moved by so much of what you brought up, and I think also the very personal dimension of a combatant going home into their community and thinking about what you said with the generational impact, and how we see in places where this kind of violence has taken place also extended and an increase over many years of gender-based violence, domestic violence. And so it continues to affect communities. But I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Tanya Domi, who is today's discussant. Tanya is an adjunct assistant professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and a faculty affiliate of the Harriman Institute, where she teaches human rights and international affairs in the Western Balkans. The focus of Tanya's research is policy-oriented on transitional justice issues, including women and LGBTQI human rights, genocide, and atrocity crimes. Prior to joining the Harriman faculty in 2008, Domi worked for the late Congressman Frank McCloskey, a champion for U.S. intervention to stop the Bosnian War, and she served as his defense policy analyst during the first 2 years of the Balkan Wars. Tanya was seconded by the State Department to the OSCE BIH mission between 1996 and 2000, serving in major roles as an advisor to the late U.S. Ambassador Robert Froelich and a counselor under U.S. Ambassador Robert Berry. She later served as the OSCE spokesperson between 1999 and 2000. She's currently the president of the advisory board of the Post-Conflict Research Center based in Sarajevo and is a non-residential fellow, senior fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding based in Washington, D.C. Tanya has widely published as an author and commentator on U.S. foreign policy, human rights, and international relations, and is a close colleague. Tanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Kate, I am so thrilled you're with us today. I mean, I invited you to come and give a book talk, and then the pandemic descended upon all of us. And I felt like this book was so important that it deserved the platform that you've earned fair and square. And I want to congratulate you on a really incredible piece of work, one that is unique, I think, in the Bosnian post-war canon. And I think it should take a rightful place on anybody's bookshelf, especially those of us who are addicted to the region, and I happen to be one of them. But I will also add, you go beyond the Western Balkans, you go beyond former Yugoslavia, and throughout the book, you show how your findings and your knowledge about irregular forces, volunteers, militia, are present and have been present in every genocide during the 20th century, starting with the Armenians, followed by the Holocaust, the Shoah, and all of these are identity-based atrocity crimes. And I have to give you a lot of credit, and you say in the contemporary in I think a really useful way when you point to Rwanda and also Darfur, but then you also go as far afield as Afghanistan and talk extensively and address the Syrian conflict, which vexed so many of us. And so many of us were so distressed about what took place and the lack of action by former President Obama, who said, you know, when Assad gasses his civilian population, that will be my red line. And then he refused to follow through. And then we saw thousands upon thousands flee into Europe. And that actually was politically destabilizing, in my view, to many political powers in Europe, from Germany from Berlin to London. There was a lot of dislocation out of that issue. I would just also make the point, which I smiled when I read, that you make no apology that this book stands between academia and your advocacy. I love that because I have solidarity in that. I connect to that. And I think it's such a good piece of work that anybody that really cares, you also bring up Myanmar, and you discuss what's going on there and how this is also played out with irregular militia and those actors that are involved and connected to the state. So I give you full credit, and it's incredible, rigorous work going through the archives of the ICTY transcripts and the trials. I have to say, given that I teach human rights and I use those archives, I fully appreciate what you're talking about. They tell the story in a way that no one else can. And I would also add, there's been some very creative use of those archives. Depth 2, an incredible film on the Kosovo massacre, how they used the audio tapes from ICTY as the speaking voice in the film itself, which is remarkable. And you don't know it until you get to the end of the film, that those were voices of witnesses and people who came forward and people who were testifying actually in the tribunal. I also want to talk about how you talk about at the beginning of the Yugoslavian wars, in the breakup of Yugoslavia, about how London and also DC and probably Brussels and Berlin really orientalized the history of the Balkan Wars, the history of the region. And they actually said, oh, well, they did this, this is a continuation of their, wars against one another. And as a matter of fact, in the American case, Robert Kagan's book, The Balkan Ghost Book, is one of the reasons why President Clinton said he didn't get in at the beginning of the war, because they were, this is like something we don't understand. They're just killing each other. And you bring this up over and over in the book because there's just so many examples of it, that's a way to keep some distance and a plausible deniability, or we just don't understand. We don't understand what they're doing here. And I used to say, when I was sitting at my desk in Washington, I would say, well, they need to talk to an anthropologist. They need to talk to some historians that actually know the accurate history. I would also add that the book also, how you organize the presentation of the architectures of crime and how you lay out the militaries of each of the ethnic groups, which is, I think, really important, because just mapping it out, seeing it on paper, you just don't even see that on paper. When I was on the ground in Bosnia after the war, you never saw anything like that. And I think that's really the fact that you've laid it out and organized it and explained those architectures and the relationships between command structures and with local population is in great detail, is quite a contribution. Like, nobody can walk away from this book and say, I don't know now. You compel them to know. They know. And not only that, I believe that your book actually is a refutation to genocide denial, because you have documented so extensively that while your book isn't about addressing genocide denial, in fact, you're doing that through the book itself and the rigorous documentation. I would also say that one of the things that has come to mind, you did quote Richard Wilson, who I adore, I deeply admire. One of the things that I got really interested in, because I did a lot of work with the media when I was in Bosnia and later in Montenegro, is that incitement happens through these structures and through these loose relationships. But one of the main avenues that these leaders used is part of the architecture was through the media. And it was actually integral to their military campaigns that they would capture terrestrial antennas for the means to impart their ideology, and they would incite and escalate violence through those architectures. And as a matter of fact, Wilson has written an incredible book, Incitement, making the case for criminal prosecution of incitement. And he said that he was so troubled by the acquittal of Shechel. That's why he wrote the book. And so what's interesting to me about that, I know we're going a little bit off your book, but it's about what happens through incitement, is that ICTR, the Rwandan tribunal, actually did have a conviction on the media and actually sentenced 3 men to prison for incitement that led to genocide in the convictions of all 3 of those people. Ironically, the ICTY did not do that. They did not pursue a media case, and media was demonstrated to actually play a central role in the incitement. So when we're talking about these situations on the ground and about what happens informally, I think that is something that we should all be looking at, the use and application of media and how they actually drive the incitement. And you, as you spoke in your opening remarks, you talked about disinformation and how that's always been with us. Well, in fact, at Nuremberg, Jules Streicher was convicted for his role as editor of the major Nazi newspaper, and he was hung for his crimes. And of course, Goebbels was the propagandist, and Shechel was a propagandist, and actually Vucic himself was a mouthpiece for a propagandist. So that's something that I think we all should think about, how that comes into the architecture. I mean, you have done an amazing job on this, and I would say that the use of, and you document it quite well, the use of the scorpions, Archon's tigers, all of these, and in this regard, the Serbs were much more organized through these paramilitaries, as you point out. But I think also part of their role was to, in fact, inject fear. I mean, literal fear, because they would come into, particularly in Eastern Bosnia, when they would come across the border into those villages, they would actually play the music March of Peace in the most dystopian manner and begin to plunder, pillage, rape, and burn while they were engaged in committing these horrible crimes. I also like the discourse of the book, which is repeated throughout, about how Milosevic and all of them were able to say, "Oh, I don't know anything about that. I don't know how that happened." You know, they used the arm's length plausible deniability while they were engaged in cooperating in these covert relationships, and you draw out for the reader about how the prosecution and accountability process is so state oriented that it was challenging to actually be able to document and prove about these relationships. Now, you point to the transcripts, which are absolutely right about, and despite some of the dissatisfaction with ICTY, they actually did a fairly good job on documenting those relationships, in many cases under the rubric of a joint criminal enterprise. And you point that out. But I would also add that this has also been going on forever. And I was taken with your how you described it with the Nazi regime. Was it the I'm sorry, the group, I forget the word for the paramilitary used by the Third Reich.
The Einsatzgruppen?
Yes. How they use those actors to go in and do a lot of destruction locally. And use them also in the concentration camps. So I find that unsettling, but also consistent. And so you've proven your thesis over and over, Kate. You've proven your thesis, and that in itself should open the eyes of policymakers in all the major capitals that have the capacity to address and interdict and stop the escalation of these crimes. One of the other outcomes of Yugoslavia, and you do point this out. In some places, you talk about the emergence of R2P. I would add 1325 on women, peace, and security emerged. I would also.
Tanya, your mic is off.
Sorry, my mouse moved. For all the shortcomings of the United Nations, and there are many, and I would say at this point in time, I never thought their status and their credibility would be so diminished, and it's probably, I think, in my lifetime at its lowest ebb, but particularly as a professional in this work. And but they have introduced the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council, and I would say that's probably been the best addition, and actually does put a state in a defensive position and makes them accountable, particularly with NGOs that are present and able to also contribute their findings. So these things have emerged after horrific crimes, in particular with regard to women. In Bosnia, we're talking 25 to 50,000 women raped. In Kosovo, it's estimated to be 25,000. In terms of what happened in Iraq, Yazidi women, the trafficking, the enslavement, and the compulsory rapes that have been carried out there. I did not think you could exceed the brutality that took place in Bosnia, but I think indeed ISIS has managed to do that. And yet all of these initiatives, Kate, I just want to say, despite all these initiatives, are these just empty words? Are these empty policies? This is part of the toolbox, and yet it does not appear to me, despite all the following UN Security Council resolutions that followed 1325 to reinforce it, and we have centers, university centers on 1325. There is a part of me that just says, what more can we do? But yet there's no political will to carry it forward, it seems, at this time. I do want to hear your thoughts about this. The last thing I want to say is that your recommendations, how you thoroughly put such a great forward to this, and in the prologue, it is such a great book, and I think it's a reference book too, I might add, and I think you do great justice. I mean, I was very impressed by your 10, 12 pages on just describing the breakup of Yugoslavia. I was like, wow, she's starting here that well, that effectively. I know this is going to be good. So I'm going to tell every friend I have and all of my Balkan friends that indeed this book is very, very important. It should take a special place on a bookshelf and should be used as a reference. And actually, I will draw from this book in my class in the fall. And I would also add that I want to ask you, in terms of protection approaches, you've actually added in LGBTI, and you mention it in the book. And that to me is very reassuring. I have great concerns about Russia's role in the Balkans right now, and will that yield to attacks on this discrete group of people, which is probably the most successful post-war social justice movement in the Western Balkans, is indeed the LGBTI organizing. And lastly, how you lay out the the distancing over and over and over. And it does say something to me about the lack of curiosity too. I mean, why didn't people want to know? why don't, I would think generals, I would think that military people would be more interested in terms of the relationships, like how people are connected. And I will say that despite my personal despair on a number of fronts, I will give Joe Biden some credit on the new sanctions regime. And, he actually, reading the executive order of June 2021 is pretty remarkable, in that it literally says that following the breakup of the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as well as widespread corruption within various governments and institutions, that they will take actions that actually disturb the peace and that cause dissension in the Balkans. And so we'll have to see where they take this. They have applied it now in Bosnia on 3 persons, including Dodik. And I have to say that this might not be Magnitsky, but it is certainly a new regime. And you talk about you've talked about using sanctions, and yet I think one country's not enough. And you've criticized the EU as well, because they've been slow, if not just never. And currently, Joseph Borrell, the high rep for foreign policy in the EU, opposes sanctions. And I think it's regrettable that Germany and the UK have talked about it and they haven't applied them. It would be a force multiplier if they'd follow the United States here. So I will end there. Congratulations, Kate. It's a wonderful contribution and you should be very proud.
Before we go on, I just want to say wow and thank you, and how much it fills my sort of heart and my brain. And I can't say how gratified and sort of grateful and how much it means to have sort of, your thoughtful, generous reflections on that book. It means an enormous amount, given your long and varied experience and commitment to a more inclusive and just Bosnia. It means an extraordinary amount, and so thank you ever so much. And I hope now we can sort of get into some of those kind of questions and themes. Yes. I was scribbling down, and of course, if we were in person, we'd be, I imagine us kind of, I don't know, in armchairs or something, and we'd have been, I'd have derailed us already. So the good thing about online is that I can mute myself, and I hand over to Laura to take us from here. But thank you.
Well,
Tanya.
I do want to ask you a couple of questions if I could.
So please do.
So R2P 1325 and the Human Rights Council. Tell me your thoughts. I mean, these are, I believe they did evolve because of what happened in former Yugoslavia.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And I suppose I have a couple of ways of answering that, and it tends to depend on kind of the day of the week and what my blood sugar level is like, probably. I mean, the historian in me, these very important changes and shifts in process and expectation and bureaucratic structure and resource are very, very new, and the responsibility to protect was adopted only in 2005. And, I come from a practice of studying the history of rights and ideas in the European tradition, and looking at Europe's experience of human rights and that evolution. And 15 years isn't very long. And if you look at the trajectory of even the last couple of 100 years, to get to a point where every single member state ultimately committed collectively that the lives of populations in foreign countries rested above the unquestionable right of state sovereignty is extraordinary. Now, as with anything, you know, these tools and these ideas come from a combination of kind of intellectual ideas, advocacy, luck, politics, and very often in that it can be hard to keep the experience and perspective and expertise of those most closely affected by violence in mind. And it certainly is going to be very unlikely for these emerging rights to be held dear to those who are most closely affected by violence, because they're not helping them. However, I mean, you know, I think that the tremendous outpouring from the people of Myanmar, holding up these banners of "We want R2P," spelling it out in candles, when there are tenured professors of politics and philosophy sat in very nice universities tweeting that this idea is dead and it doesn't help anyone. To me, there is an inconsistency there, you know, and on the one hand, we are probably at risk of having these standards that we set within the human rights community and also within our states and within our systems and within the United Nations. You know, the Human Rights Act itself in the UK, or the UN Declaration of Human Rights within the United Nations, it sets a standard, and at the same time as seeking to raise that standard, it also raises expectations that for so many people, and too many people, it falls short. And so when we get these steps forward, it both exposes that inconsistency, and that is very uncomfortable for those of us working in human rights, but that's nothing to the discomfort and struggle to those who do not have those rights and those who are being let down by the promises that those standards offer. It is my belief that those standards help us push forward. I recognize that that is not universally held and that that is contested, and that you need to have some level of optimism and idealism to hold on to that, especially right now. But ultimately, I feel it is the pragmatism and strategy part of my brain that also thinks those steps forward are so important. In the book, I look at structure, and I look at bureaucracy, and I look at rational interest and political interest, because that is what drives forward decisions. And it's what drives negative and malign and violent decisions and structures. But it is also what drives, unfortunately, on the, you know, any kind of systemic change, which includes positive change and progressive change and inclusive change. And so I don't believe that the United Nations as a system, or our state structure, or our state-centric approach can ever be the whole answer. But we can't take it out, and we can't not fight for it. But we push in these different ways towards this progress. I think also some things have changed in the last 15 years. And, you know, progress isn't a straight line. And so on the one hand, I think that we can point, for example, to the United Kingdom's relationship with Bosnia in the 1990s, the way in which our parliament talked about Bosnia particularly, and the Western Balkans more generally, was appalling. I would say that it was racist, it was divisive, it was callous, it was unevidenced. And it is that discourse is one of the things that drove, legitimized, and allowed Britain's leadership of very, very bad international policy towards Bosnia in the 90s. Now, the debates that the UK are holding in the British Parliament, and it is an immense privilege and a very humbling role to be able to play some role in contributing to where those debates come from and what is said. But we see now a cross-party solidarity with the people of Bosnia. We see a language that is respectful, that is sometimes empathetic, that is informed, and that commits to not replicating those mistakes of the past. And so just as that one example, we have seen decades of trust being built between the two nations. Of course, Paddy Ashdown had an extraordinary, amount to do with that. And, I was very privileged. I only met him once, but I did interview him for the book. And it was as he was as charming and as entertaining as one can imagine. But it's an example of how things do change. And it has changed not by luck, but by the things that we all need to do better. The UK and what Paddy Ashdown did in his office, and the UK embassy as well, has got better at listening and reaching in and recognizing that you can't just take the leaders of political entities or groups or structures or broadcasters at their word. You need to talk to the people who are doing the work, who are closely affected, and they've got better at that. As a result, that's where the Prevention of Sexual Violence Initiative, from William Hague and Baroness Hellich is where it came from. And it came as a result of listening and learning and admitting past mistakes. It has come because the UK civil society has itself recognized the gap of understanding where identity-based violence comes from, understanding the need to commemorate and recognize the crimes that were committed in Bosnia in particular, and the genocide and crimes against humanity that happened there. The fact that the UK commemorates what happened in Srebrenica every year is part of the reason that parliamentarians now stand up, that we now have a sector that works towards the prevention of mass atrocities, that we now have a working group that stands up and speaks with a collective voice, and people who work on Sri Lanka will stand up for the people of Myanmar. That has helped us shift the conversation. Now, that is not the same as why, the advancements made within the United Nations around the responsibility to protect women, peace and security, civilian protection still continue to fail, because that's about the other changes that have happened as well. And so ultimately, I think that we just have to keep moving towards a world where every decision is made with the pursuit of sort of a more just and equitable world in mind. We might not always, depending on the entity we represent, whether we are a business, whether we are a state, whether we're an NGO or just an individual, consumer, we might not always get the right answer. But integrating that thinking about how our actions impact those who are most vulnerable rather than those who have most power is all we have. And so we just have to keep going, I'm afraid. So I don't know, you can, depending on your sugar levels, you can take that as being half full or half empty. I don't know.
Right. Just one last comment. So as I said earlier, Samantha Power is in Sarajevo. We'll be there through tomorrow. And there's been a lot of activity. The UK government has stepped up in a way that we are, those of us who have been advocates for Bosnia are very pleased to see. You've played a really central role from the NGO community. And, I've been fortunate enough to work with you in my other capacity as a senior fellow at AFP. And just have to say that we're all hoping that the UK can lead in a way right now where the United States isn't. And it would be wonderful if Germany and the UK could get together, because right now it doesn't seem the Ukraine situation is overshadowing the Balkans right now. Fortunately, over the past weekend, it seems that Mr. Dodik and Mr. Vučić had come to some form of understanding, and Mr. Vučić indicated to Dodik, you need to go back to your institutions and you need to stop with the efforts to secede. And even ironically enough, as you reference the SDS, but the SDS is blocking Dodik, which is ironies of ironies. So at this moment, it's a little dialed back, and that's a good thing, because as you know, that victims, people who went through the war, they're now reliving it. And there was a number of events that took place, terrible events like what happened in Novi Pazar and in Priboj over in Serbia. These kinds of things are, as you said, earmarks. They are earmarks of escalating toward atrocity crimes, and we have to keep that from happening. So I do want to thank you, Kate, and your fellow Britons for the work you're all doing there. And now maybe, Laura, we can go to the audience questions and comments.
I'm just sitting here really grateful to be a part of the conversation, and also just my mind is sort of racing between things that happened during the Holocaust, things that are happening now, and it builds on a question that's come in. So much of conversations around the Holocaust focus on mass murder, extermination of Jewish people. But what's interesting is when I talk to colleagues, they may not necessarily know what Kristallnacht is. And certainly many of them don't know what for example, the boycott that happens in 1933 in Germany, the anti-Jewish boycott, or in the transfer of large populations, primarily but not exclusively Jewish people, that there's also money being exchanged. What happens when people are removed forcibly from their homes? It's not just about taking their property. Raoul Hilberg's dissertation in the beginning talked about who's paying the electricity bills, who's paying the gas, who's paying for their train tickets. And so thinking about this, with so much Holocaust denial going on, and thinking the Nazis perpetrated these crimes, one of the questions that comes in is, would you consider, for example, the Romanian Iron Guard in this framework that you have now to be a political party or a paramilitary group?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I suppose my cop-out answer would be like, I haven't looked at I haven't done the tracking, I haven't mapped it out, I don't know where their money was coming from, but they sit within that space. And I suppose one thing that this research taught me is that it's not so much the labels that matter, but where they fit within the structure. And what those violent entities did was they sat within a perpetrating structure specifically to carry out acts that furthered this ideological and violent goal. And so recognizing that these architectures are always going to look different across time and space. And one of the big mistakes, I think, that can be found in some of the literature of atrocity prevention, or even in the kind of like genocide studies literature, although I think we are moving away from it, is this sense of a paradigm, or this sense of the look for a kind of a set of a tick list, or an image of what we think mass atrocity crimes look like. And of course, the Holocaust is in many ways, it is the paradigm that is used of European mass violence. It is a kind of often held up as the global paradigm of genocide. And that hasn't really been very conducive for research or prevention. And, that's not to say that comparative studies isn't an extraordinary tool of our methods and our studies, whatever side we're coming to. And so, whether I would think that Iron Guard would be a paramilitary group or a political group, it's kind of both. From what I know, I'm not an expert in that, but understanding them as a tool in that same way is exactly the point that I think I'm trying to make, because they fit between that grey area. And at the moment, our current approaches and capacities for horizon scanning and predicting where atrocities come from and who may likely commit them is poor. Our capacity, when the warning signs emerge, to scenario plan, and unfortunately Bosnia is now emerging at that point where I would think some scenario planning on those networks should really be done quite quickly, not because it means that anything is inevitable, but because that information is useful in order to identify the points of leverage and influence that can help before. And you're right, Tanya, that like we kind of are in this moment of accentuated risk. And right now we're in a slightly fallow period because it looks like we've come back. but we need to be looking at the same time as weeks and days and months and years, but also decades. That's what prevention is. You're thinking at every cycle of crisis and every point of prevention. And for me, that's the kind of analytical benefit that network analysis can bring. You mentioned during your remarks earlier, Tanya, of sort of, why don't people want to know this stuff? And, thinking that, the military should want to know this. And it's interesting, where I find the most interest is actually among military actors.
Yes.
I think, when you speak to those NATO commanders that were involved in what happened in Libya, and, what happened during and after that intervention, we can all agree did not work. And that is true. That initial intervention almost certainly saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But when you talk to them about what went wrong, some of the things that they will say is the absence of that kind of knowledge, the absence of that kind of intelligence, of network analysis of who was who, and the civilian knowledge, the absence of military to civilian engagement. And I really think that, take apart military action for a moment, the capacities do exist within some militaries, and I've certainly spoken with those within the US military who work thinking about capabilities and systems around atrocity prevention, and there is some interest there, and I think that would be positive to explore. I think that the intelligence services tend to do this kind of work for other reasons, for a number of different and related global challenges, whether that is violent extremism, terrorist networks, whether that's serious or organized crime. There is the capabilities of mapping these networks. It's just not done for widespread human rights violations. Now, if we are going to borrow from some of those lessons, please, can we also make sure that some of the principles of atrocity prevention, which centers human rights, centers a very human and 360 understanding of perpetrators and prevention, we could maybe bring some of that thinking into where that analysis and mapping of terrorist networks, of serious organized crime networks, of gangs, of various armed actors, particularly say in the MENA region, but also in Latin America, and where the absence of that human rights framework has led to some very poor policy decisions that have taken that information and then perhaps not given it the analysis that say a human rights or atrocity prevention or any kind of prevention framework would lead to. So I think the potential for bringing some tools together is very rich.
I would just add, when you came to the States, we were talking about Samantha Power, to her credit, set up this atrocity prevention apparatus in the National Security Council, and Trump moved it to the State Department. It still exists, but I want to know what they're doing. I mean, they should be making an assessment right now. And people at the National Security Council should be doing that similarly. But I think right now, Ukraine is sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And that's my fear about the situation in Bosnia right now, that there's distraction, and that's what happens. And Putin is playing chess while the rest of us are playing checkers, in my view, because he wants to open up a second front. And so I remain very concerned about all these prevention mechanisms and early warning mechanisms. The OSCE has a commissioner for national minorities. He or she should be on a plane. To former Yugoslavia, to Belgrade and to Sarajevo, and actually to Zagreb as well, in my view.
I think it's really interesting that so far the conversation is focusing on military versus civilian engagement, thinking about different ways to analyze this violence. And a question's come in that also poses another question, which is, how do you see the impact or influence of diasporic groups in contributing to paramilitary groups, particularly funding and propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question. And one of the kind of areas of the research I found both most interesting, but also really pertinent to the parts of the architecture that are least talked about when it comes to perpetration and prevention. And, you know, of course, in former Yugoslavia, in sort of the late 80s, early 90s, and in some cases before that, the role of the diaspora, particularly on the Croatian and Serbian sides, was instrumental in securing political engagement and influence, lobbying for securing the legal transfer of arms and the illegal transfer of arms. And, you know, the activities of those groups were extraordinarily important. And we saw, you know, many they call themselves sort of returnees, although of course many of them hadn't ever stepped foot in the country and until they went back to fight. And again, this isn't something that is particularly Balkan or particularly related to former Yugoslavia. It is by necessity, in a sense, inherently linked to the dynamics of modern violence, because often atrocity crimes will occur during periods of transition. And often during those periods of transition, something changes. And so those people who for some reason couldn't come in or had left will return home, and return home again, using that loosely, whether they've been born there or not, you know, feel that that desire to re-engage in a different way, and that comes in different shapes and sizes. And sometimes it is a capacity to influence for the things that sort of we're talking about now in terms of human rights and prevention and engagement and resilience. And sometimes it is to divide, or for opportunistic reasons, or for ideological or for violent reasons. And I think that it is something that seems to me to be very lacking in at least I can speak from the UK experience, from the UK approach to modern atrocities. There is a reluctance and sometimes I think a fear of engaging with diaspora communities present here in the UK, because there is that knowledge that the diaspora is not one thing from one country ever. And so while at the same time, you know, say we take Sudan as an example, you know, the Sudanese diaspora in the UK hold enormous knowledge, expertise, perspective, you know, sort of contacts, networks that would be very useful if the government was able to have that trusted relationship. But then there is also on the other side, of course, you know, there will be some, because there are in all diaspora networks, and the government is sort of then afraid to engage with. And, you know, not to bang the same drum throughout this talk, but that's why the analysis of who is who and where the money is going and the detail is so important, because it helps governments understand who they can trust, who they can go to within the diaspora. It helps understand where sanctions is going to have an impact and where it won't, and the opportunity for creative, smart sanctions that might target in a slightly different way, slightly lower profile, but actually it's going to hit, you know, where X supplies are coming through Y port or something like that.
Yes, and I think mapping out their financial connections is, you know, very, very important. And they've done that in the sanctions regime on Dodik and the other two people. And I will give them credit. He was sanctioned for his corrupt relationship with Alternativa Televizia. It's a media outlet, and has directed public money into it and has hired family members to run it, and also to shape the messages that this media outlet puts out. And that is an important move. I will give them their full due in this action.
On the topic of sanctions, I was watching one of your previous book talks, and you talked about the significance of sanctions against Serbia.
Mhm.
And so far, so much of this conversation, again, is focusing on architecture. And I really like how you focus on the diaspora not being just one thing. And I wanted to ask a question on behalf of another person that's asked this question, which is your research and talking more on the impacts of family relationships, specifically perpetrators going home to their families, continuing the atrocity work the next day, and the impact this has on nuclear and extended families, both inside the country and then diaspora communities decades later on. And the question also focuses on what are ways to intervene in this kind of continuation of the history of violence and intergenerational tacit participation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is a great question, and I think that I suppose that the broader way of thinking about that challenge is the importance of community building, social cohesion, and investing in community activities, right? And that is the same for every society in the world. Identity-based violence isn't something that only exists in some places some of the time. It is present in some form or another where people experience discrimination or structural or physical violence because of how others see an aspect of their identity. That exists. That is a phenomenon that exists everywhere. And one of the best, most evidenced way of countering that is building stronger, more inclusive, more empathetic, more sort of critically thinking societies. And so that is, I think, really important. But on that sort of very specific kind of question around families and when violence is taking place, I sort of really tried to go as deep as I could within the scope of the project. Particularly, I was interested in this sort of these wives and girlfriends, these partners of the paramilitary fighters. I was able to find out a little bit more about those in relationships with Serbian and Bosnian Serb paramilitaries or those fighting on that side. And of course, when you look to families, I was looking here at a very heteronormative, highly masculine and feminine. This is the 1990s. They're taking explicitly guidance from pornography, from Rambo films, from pop culture, highly capitalist kind of accoutrement of sort of stylized identities, and recognizing the importance of those cultural shifts and the appropriation of them, reinforcing gender identities, reinforcing family structures in a way that is slightly different, but only maybe in the accoutrement of the deliberate attempts by both the Catholic and Orthodox churches, for example, of reasserting the binary, more traditional gender stereotypes, but also where women should live. They should go back into the home. They should stop working as they did under the communist system. Abortion rights were curtailed. And so I feel like what I was able to think more deeply about when I was doing this research was thinking, again, these changes don't always look how we think they are going to look. And so just because these identities, particularly within this subculture of where violence was celebrated and where there was a kind of patriotic glamour to the criminality and violence of some people perpetrating these crimes or even celebrating these crimes, that didn't look like the traditional hierarchical, sort of patriarchal family, because people were looking at it through the wrong lens. But it didn't mean that the structures and the reassertion wasn't the same. And I think that holds a good lesson for us. We know that one of the big indicators of risk, not only to women, but of all minoritized and minority groups, is the reassertion of traditional patriarchal gender roles, the rollback of reproductive rights, and the reassertion of patriarchal hegemony. And when we know that that's not, again, that is not something that is just unique or specific to former Yugoslavia or even the Western Balkans. Now, it is something that can be seen in practically every instance of modern mass atrocity. And so if we know that, and we should be looking at indicators such as abortion rights, such as the right to work, women's right to work, then we need to be consistent in protecting them. And many of the states that consider themselves to be at the forefront of preventing mass atrocities or upholding its responsibilities towards human rights or to protect people from atrocities are perhaps also not doing that domestically. They're not looking at those rights. They're not looking at the rights of their own minority and marginalized communities. And so the importance of that 360 thinking, that recognizing community building, inclusive, strong communities, whether that's through education, whether that is through investing in community-led work, I think that is integral. And when violence starts, how can you then reach those people who have the most influence over the perpetrators themselves, who sometimes are going to be those in the family? And that is a creative challenge for all of us. It's not an easy one, but we have new tools and new access that we have never had before. Through Twitter, we can literally reach them. I'm not saying that Twitter is the answer at all. Please do not quote me on that. But we have these opportunities to think about what that means.
I do want to say that I have become a cinephile of former Yugoslavia, Bosnian films and Serbian films. And I will say this, it occurs to me often when I'm in the region, and I think about it even now, thousands and thousands of people killed other people. Thousands of them raped and mutilated other people, and they've never been made accountable. And I think about, what do the women of these men who came home, and it's been a long time, I get it, but does it ever occur to them, and this would be a sociological study, obviously, has it ever occurred to them, is their husband or their boyfriend, were they rapists? I mean, this was ubiquitous. And of course, this comes out in some really extraordinary films. Donnie Stanovic's film on An Ordinary Woman, where she finds her husband's boots, and he in a drawer in his dresser, and he tells her not to look at it. And in fact, he was engaged in mass atrocity crimes. And so it's out there, but I'm not sure anybody ever gets to a level of discussion. But I also might add that in general, as you point to, Kate, about this heteronormative way of living, Orthodox, Catholic, of course, there's that too with Muslims. But I will say this, people are leaving in massive numbers. I mean, the migration out, the depopulation out is so significant that I really believe it is a threat to the security and to the well-being of all those countries. I mean, we're talking about massive departures, and people are leaving because they aren't accepted. I know LGBT people that have left, they've sought asylum. I've actually been an expert testifier on their behalf in the United States on a number of cases. I have a case right now from North Macedonia. And I would just say that people, if they don't have an opportunity, and so many young people, so many people want to stay, so many people are so well educated, and because of corruption and because of so many other factors, nepotism, they can't get a job. And so the lack of opportunity, the intolerance of difference, the lack of respect and the lack of ability to bring people together, because they continue the leadership of many of these countries, and in other countries too, where mass atrocities have taken place, is the rhetoric of discrimination and alienation by leaders.
Yeah.
And this is where I think the floor underneath people's feet is really quite fragile.
Yeah.
And that's one of my greatest concerns.
I mean, I also think that in addition to everything that you've just said, that when people who, if they stayed, would resist, leave, it makes it, and this is not said with any judgment of those who leave, but it can be seen as strategically beneficial to those would-be forces of division. And you know, the extent to which that is a deliberate strategy, you know, will vary from case by case. But there is a reason why authoritarian regimes will often force people to leave, because it's easier.
Sure.
And you know, it's just an additional sobering thought to everything that you just said.
Sorry, and I don't mean to be so negative, because there's somebody that's watching right now, Velma Sadic, my colleague.
Hi, Velma.
And she's somebody who's chosen to stay and to build and work towards a peaceful future, a sustainable future in Bosnia. And that, to me, is one of the most admirable efforts, one of the most righteous efforts to be engaged in. So I want to say
and Velma is a powerhouse. So
she's a powerhouse.
So we've got Velma on your side, then watch out. So
that's exactly right. And there are lots of people like her too, that are doing really great work. And I want them to have that chance, to have that opportunity to prove that it can be done, and it is the right thing to do.
You both said so much. We have a few more minutes. So some words that popped out: discrimination, alienization, a breakdown of local communities, a reassertion of patriarchy, gender, denial of reproductive rights. Kate, how much of your analysis can be used for what's happening in the United States?
I mean, great question. And I mean, short answer, all of it. One of the founding principles of protection approaches was that the prevention of identity-based violence isn't needed in some places, all of the, you know, some places, some of the time, but everywhere, all of the time. And, you know, we, you know, came from backgrounds in genocide prevention, but explicitly established an organization that would look domestically at the risks of identity-based violence, including mass atrocity crimes, but also includes violent extremism and hate crime, and, you know, a raft of different manifestations that come from that shared root, where perpetrators are driven by their conceptualization or the manipulation of an understanding of their victim's identity. And, you know, we use a set of indicators or a framework of analysis that draws on, you know, some of the cases of best practice of frameworks that exist out there, but we are increasingly working to co-create those frameworks with other communities to make sure that any gaps are sort of accounted for. But ultimately, I mean, you can assess the risks anywhere, and we have done in the past. We've done all sorts of kind of evidence reviews, public survey reviews of those indicators of risk around the UK. And so, for example, in 2019, following, you know, really some years of very divisive language, rhetoric, political campaigns around the referendum to leave the European Union, and many sort of contested areas of policy, the emergence of many culture wars, you know, we deemed the UK to be entering a new period of heightened risk, where hate crime would be likely to go up, that violent extremism would be likely to go up, and that if the UK encountered a political, economic, or otherwise unforeseen crisis, it would be really an alarming situation. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and we did see dramatic rises in hate crime, particularly against East and Southeast Asian communities, but not only. We have seen a rapid deterioration of the standards of political behavior. We have seen a trend towards, frankly, wider scale sort of political corruption. We have seen a prime minister who routinely lies to Parliament. We have seen the abuse of domestic and international law by our government. There are a raft of legislative bills in our House of Commons and House of Lords right now that, from my perspective, can only be interpreted as a coordinated and targeted attack on our minoritized and minority communities, but particularly our Black and ethnic minority communities. From policing to borders. And so I do think that framework of analysis can be applied to the United States. And, while we in the UK do not yet have the challenges of paramilitary or armed actors, the United States, of course, does and has done for really some, actually sort of since its founding, since, the European forces occupied the land. And we in the UK see that internationalization or transatlantic development of those networks, where we don't yet, thankfully, have the same challenges with publicly displaying arms and gun control. But we do know that there are many groups, particularly on the anti-vax side of the internet, with the far right side of the internet, that are engaging much, much more frequently. And I would very much like the US and UK to be collaborating much, much more closely on that network analysis, because you can definitely predict where identity-based violence and extremism will come from that corner. And also you would imagine to see some of those networks funding and facilitating the perpetration of wider crimes elsewhere. So I think, any strategies, any national approaches to the prevention of mass atrocity crimes, which we know is something that both the US and the UK share in terms of a commitment of trying to do more on, must look domestically, or they simply won't ever have the power that they do. And going back to Tanya's challenge earlier of how much has changed, and her skepticism around some of these prevention efforts. And of course, I see myself as steeped in those prevention efforts, but you're right. And until we can find some consistency between our domestic and our international understanding and commitment to these crimes, when we sit in the United Kingdom or the United States, we have to understand that hypocrisy.
I want to thank our audience for the questions from the audience. I want to thank the Harriman Institute and Carly Jackson for her work coordinating this webinar. And Kate Ferguson, I am so pleased that we were able to host you. You deserve this. I hope you will come back. I have plans for you in April that will include Laura too. I just hope I'm going to be able to drag you from the UK Parliament. And this was a really special event and a very important one in our Balkan programming. And you're the first event of the semester. And thank you so much for being here today.
It's been my enormous pleasure. And thank you so much. And I will come back whenever you ask me.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thanks everybody from New York. Everyone have a good evening or a good afternoon wherever you are.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye-bye.